She was born in a modest town, nestled in the rolling hills of Virginia, where oak trees shaded quiet porches, and family ties ran deep. Her name was Carol. From the outside, their family looked picture-perfect holiday cards in matching sweaters, Sunday lunches after church, and smiles for the neighbors. But inside the Bennett home, there was an unspoken hierarchy, and Carol had always known exactly where she stood. Her older sister, Diane, was the sun around which everything revolved. Her face lined the hallway walls, captured in graduation gowns, cheerleader uniforms, and piano recital programs. There wasn't a surface in that house untouched by Diane's achievements. Carol's own drawings, awards, or birthday photos never made it to the fridge. When she turned 10, she was told the bakery had closed early, no cake this year. But the next morning, she found half of Diane's leftover graduation cake on the counter, her name still written in pink icing. Her mother said with a shrug, "Cake is cake." The message was always the same. Diane's milestones were family events. Carol's moments were passing footnotes. When she made honor roll in middle school, no one mentioned it at dinner. That same week, Diane had joined the debate team, and all conversation turned in her direction. Carol learned to keep her joy quiet, tucked away in journal entries, or whispered to the mirror before bed. It wasn't just the praise that was uneven, it was everything. Diane had a brand new desk, private tutors, and summer camps out of state. Carol studied from hand-me-down textbooks with torn covers. When she asked for music lessons, she was handed Diane's old violin too large for her frame. Strings already frayed. "We already spent a lot on Diane's piano this year," her mother explained. As if one child's needs should always eclipse another's. Even in silence, the contrast was deafening. Carol slept beneath a ceiling with peeling paint, while Diane's room was repainted every year to match her growing tastes. Carol's clothes came from second-hand bags Diane had outgrown. Her bike was a rusting frame, salvaged from a neighbor's garage. Yet through it all, Carol didn't protest. She watched, she adjusted, she adapted. Because in the Bennett household, speaking up often meant being labeled ungrateful. Carol began to mistake invisibility for peace. It felt safer to disappear than to be told she was wrong for wanting equal ground. She carried that habit into her teenage years. When she won a regional art contest in high school, she didn't even tell her parents. She knew they'd be too busy preparing for Diane's college tours. So she stood alone on that stage in a school auditorium, holding her plaque, imagining what it might feel like to have someone cheer just for her. That kind of quiet neglect doesn't scream. It hums low and constant until you grow used to the noise. Carol didn't realize how heavy it all was until years later, when she looked back and couldn't find a single memory where she felt like she mattered as much as her sister. Not once. Not on a birthday. Not on graduation day. Not even when she left for college with nothing but a partial scholarship and a suitcase held shut with a belt. It wasn't just favoritism. It was a slow, persistent erasure of self-worth. And when it's written into your childhood, it follows you. Into your choices. Your relationships. Your voice. But as we'll see next, that pattern didn't fade. It only deepened, matured into expectations disguised as family values. Carol became not just the forgotten daughter, but the dependable one. The reliable backup. And in the name of family, she was asked to give more than she ever received. By the time Carol reached her late teens, the roles in her family had hardened like concrete left too long in the sun. There was no more pretending it was just a phase, or that one day things would even out. Diane was the daughter who earned investments. Carol was the one expected to adjust. That quiet favoritism of childhood had grown into a full-blown pattern, predictable, immovable, and, worst of all, unquestioned. When Diane left for Vanderbilt, her parents held a backyard farewell party that nearly rivaled a wedding. White tents, a catered brunch, even a slideshow set to music. Carol watched from the edge of the yard, sipping store-brand lemonade, wondering what it might feel like to be celebrated so completely. A year later, when Carol packed for a local community college, her only option, since her parents said they could only afford to help halfway, there was no send-off, no cake, no framed photo. Just a reminder to check the oil in her second-hand car, which her father had reluctantly agreed to co-sign, with the warning, "Don't expect us to bail you out if something breaks." What Diane got without asking, Carol had to earn twice over and still be grateful for the crumbs. Diane had private SAT tutors. Carol borrowed test prep books from the library. Diane got a car. Carol got a bus schedule and a roll of quarters for emergencies. When Diane called home about a stressful exam, Their mother would drive for hours just to cook her favorite meal. When Carol sprained her ankle during finals and asked if someone could bring her groceries, she got a voicemail that said, "You're a grown-up now, honey. Time to figure things out." Even in adulthood, the imbalance followed her like a long shadow. When Diane got her first job in Charlotte, their parents knew someone at the firm and helped get her foot in the door. When Carol landed a marketing internship through sheer grit and luck, they barely asked what company it was. Instead, the conversation quickly turned to how Diane's job had a higher salary and better dental. That kind of constant comparison doesn't just hurt, it warps you. It teaches you to measure your worth against someone else's applause. Carol began to shrink from sharing her accomplishments at all, afraid they'd sound like complaints, or worse, like rivalry. So she stopped speaking. She swallowed her pride, her joy, even her anger, and learned to say, "I'm just happy Diane's doing well." But deep down, that shrinking had a cost. It drained her confidence drop by drop, until she could barely remember the version of herself who used to dream of big cities, gallery openings, and writing her own name on a lease that didn't require approval. Favoritism, when sustained for decades, doesn't just define relationships, defines identity. And for Carol, it wrote a silent contract. You will always come second. Your dreams must be flexible. Your needs must be postponed. Your voice must be gentle, or not spoken at all. And yet, even with all of that, she stayed. She came home on holidays. She offered to help plan Diane's bridal shower. She showed up when the twins were born, because part of her still believed hopes that being reliable might one day earn her what being exceptional never did. To be chosen, just once, without needing to prove her worth. But that choice never came. Not when Diane bought a home and their parents drained savings to help with the down payment. Not when Carol struggled to pay off student loans on a salary that barely covered rent. Every financial conversation, every family gathering, was an echo of the same message. Diane needs us more. What Carol didn't realize then was that the cost of being the dependable one wasn't just burnout, it was invisibility. Still, she kept going, not because she didn't feel the weight, but because she'd never been taught she had the right to put it down. Until one day, she cracked not with a scream, but with a whisper, "I need a vacation." It sounded harmless, ordinary even. But that quiet declaration would become the first domino. Because what came next wasn't just a vacation, it was a rebellion wrapped in a plane ticket. And for the first time in her life, Carol was about to choose herself. By the time Diane announced her engagement, Carol had already grown used to her role in the family, not as a participant, but as support staff. So when her mother handed her a thick binder labeled wedding planning, Carol didn't question it. Of course, she would be the maid of honor. Of course, she would coordinate the bridal shower, call vendors, manage seating charts, and calm Diane down during dress fittings. It was never phrased as a request, just a quiet expectation delivered with a smile. And so, without being asked, she gave her weekends, her evenings, her sleep. She scheduled cake tastings between work calls. She folded linen napkins while answering client emails. And when she gently reminded her mother she was already stretched thin, juggling a full-time job and a freelance side hustle just to cover bills, the response came with a patronizing laugh. "Don't be selfish, sweetheart. This is your sister's special time." That phrase became the anthem of the next 12 months. This is Diane's moment. Every little inconvenience Carol endured was rebranded as love. Every boundary she tried to set was labeled bitterness. It didn't matter that she was exhausted, or that she cried alone in her car after another chaotic weekend. What mattered was that Diane got her perfect day, that she wore her designer gown in a sunlit vineyard, while Carol, bleary-eyed and blistered, managed logistics behind the scenes like a wedding planner who didn't get paid. After the wedding came the baby's twin boys, who arrived like a thunderclap and changed everything yet again. Their birth should have been a joyous occasion. But for Carol, it marked a shift that was as subtle as it was consuming. It started with a simple favor. "Could you watch them for a few hours? I haven't slept in days." She said yes, of course she did. Who wouldn't want to help? But a few hours became full Saturdays, then Sundays too, then evenings, until the line between aunt and unpaid nanny disappeared. There was no schedule, no thanks, no consideration for Carol's time. Just text messages like "need you today," urgent, and knocks at the door with toddlers in tow. Her apartment became a second nursery, finger-painted walls, juice-stained rugs, crushed cereal in the couch cushions. She tried to push back gently, to ask for notice or a break, but the guilt came swiftly. Diane is overwhelmed. She's doing her best. You don't understand what it's like to be a mom. Carol loved the boys deeply. They brought out a tenderness in her that even she didn't expect. But love, real love, isn't measured by how much of yourself you can erase. And that's what was happening slowly, invisibly. Her time, her energy, her weekends all sacrificed at the altar of family obligation. She missed networking events, turned down weekend trips with friends, said no to career opportunities that might have required travel. Because in her family's eyes, her availability had become her value, the reliable one, the one who never said no. And behind every request was an unspoken contract. You're not married, you don't have kids, so what else could be more important? That's how love turns into duty. It doesn't announce itself with cruelty. It comes dressed as tradition, masked as closeness. And before you know it, you're not helping out, you're holding everything up. But no one thanks the pillar. No one checks if it's cracked underneath. For Carol, the breaking point came quietly, like most things in her life. It was after another weekend where the twins had broken her laptop and left permanent marker stains on her couch. She sat on the floor, surrounded by the chaos, and felt nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just a numb kind of emptiness. Like watching her own life through a fogged-up window. She realized then, her life wasn't hers anymore. And that's when the idea of a vacation came back. Not a trip, not a getaway. A full disappearance. It was the smallest act of rebellion, but it would become the start of something seismic. Because for once, Carol didn't tell anyone. She didn't ask permission. She booked a one-way ticket not to escape love, but to finally redefine it. And in doing so, she began the slow, brave work of reclaiming her life. It didn't happen with a fight. It wasn't sparked by yelling or slammed doors or a moment of rage. Carol's breaking point came in complete silence on a Sunday evening, sitting barefoot on her living room floor, staring at a half-eaten bowl of mac and cheese one of the twins had left on her rug. Her apartment was a wreck. Crayon drawings covered the walls. The TV remote was sticky. Her sofa cushion had a fresh tear. Her laptop, the one she used for work, was cracked from being stepped on. And somewhere in the kitchen, a half-balloon from one of the boys' recent visits hovered like a ghost above the mess. But the real damage wasn't the mess. It was the numbness. She couldn't feel anger, couldn't cry, couldn't even get herself to clean up. She just sat there, hands limp in her lap, wondering when exactly her life had become so unrecognizable. She had spent the last decade being everyone's safety net, the dependable one, the second responder. She filled in the cracks whenever things fell apart: weddings, babies, colds, deadlines, meltdowns. The phone always rang for her, never because of her. And each time she showed up, she hoped someone would finally see how much she was giving. But they never did. Her reliability had become invisible. That night, the exhaustion turned into a thought. A quiet, radical thought. What if I just left? She'd been fantasizing about a vacation for months. Just a few days by the ocean, somewhere warm and quiet. She had even bookmarked a modest little beachside inn in South Carolina, far cry from the family's preferred resorts. But to her, it looked like paradise. But every time she mentioned the idea at Sunday dinner, it was hijacked. Oh, the boys would love the beach. We should make it a family trip. You can watch the kids while we go on the dolphin cruise. No one asked what she wanted to do. Her vacation, like her time, her apartment, and her identity, had quietly been reassigned. So that night, as the sun set behind her apartment blinds and the silence pressed in, Carol did something uncharacteristic. She didn't wait. She didn't ask. She opened her laptop, what was left of it, and booked a room, not in the original family resort, not even in the same city. She found a secluded island off the coast of Georgia, reachable only by ferry. The place had no kid-friendly pools, no amusement parks, just quiet bungalows and empty beaches. A retreat, not a circus. And she told no one. Over the next few days, she moved like someone in a secret operation. She requested time off work using vacation days no one had ever seen her take. She packed a single suitcase, left no itinerary on the fridge. She turned off location sharing on her phone, and let her family believe she was still planning the group trip. And when the day came, she showed up at the airport hours early, walked to the opposite terminal, and boarded her flight alone. Her family's plane left for Florida that morning. She watched them from a distance, hidden behind a pillar in the terminal, Diane fussing over snacks, her husband juggling bags, the twins running in circles, her mother waving with oversized sunglasses. Carol didn't wave back. She turned, walked to her gate, and boarded a different life. On the plane, her hands shook. Not from fear, but from the unfamiliar sensation of doing something for herself. She turned off her phone before takeoff, not because it was required, but because it was the first moment in decades she didn't want to be found. For the first 2 days at the island, she felt disoriented. She kept checking the time. This is when I'd usually be putting the boys to bed. This is when Diane would call needing a ride. Her body was still on high alert. But slowly, it started to fade. She slept through the night. She ate breakfast. At noon, she sat on the beach without needing to chase anyone, or answer texts, or explain why she was unavailable. For the first time, she was unreachable. That solitude didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like oxygen. Like exhaling for the first time after holding your breath for years. She journaled. She read books with sand between the pages. She walked without purpose. And one evening, while sipping coffee outside a beach cafe, a man asked if he could join her. She said yes, not out of obligation, not out of politeness, but because she wanted to. It wasn't about romance. It was about remembering she had choices. 5 days later, when she finally turned her phone back on, it erupted: texts, missed calls, voicemails stacked like bricks, from her mother, from Diane, from work, from people she barely spoke to but who had somehow been dragged into the family chaos. Some messages were frantic, some accusatory, some manipulative. The boys are crying. How could you do this? We're worried sick. But one stood out. It was from her father. Carol, just let us know you're safe, please. No anger, no commands, just a sentence that felt human. She typed one reply. I'm safe. I'm taking some time for myself. Please give me space. I'll reach out when I'm ready. And just like that, she turned the phone off again. Because the story wasn't over. She hadn't run away from family. She had run toward herself. And for the first time in her life, Carol wasn't escaping. She was arriving. The first morning Carol woke up on the island, it was eerily quiet. No ding of text messages. No cartoons blaring from a living room TV. No footsteps thudding across her ceiling. Just the steady rhythm of the tide rising and falling outside her window, and the faint rustle of wind nudging the palm fronds against the porch-rail. She sat on the edge of the bed and waited for something, anything, to pull her back into the version of life she'd always known, but nothing came. And for the first time in years, the only person who needed her was her. The silence was not immediately peaceful. At first, it was unnerving. Her body was still trained to anticipate needs, to fix, to respond, to be alert at all times. She caught herself glancing at her phone, expecting crises. She felt guilty for eating alone. She even reached for her planner out of habit before realizing there were no meetings, no pickups, no schedules demanding her attention. Just her, in a place where no one knew her as Diane's sister or the aunt who always helps. It was strange how empty time could feel when you weren't used to owning it. But by the second day, something started to shift. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. She took a walk without a destination. She ordered lunch without thinking about who else needed to be fed. She sat under an umbrella and let the sun warm her skin without guilt. No interruptions, no apologies, just a presence. And in that stillness, a truth surfaced. She had never really been alone before. Even when she lived by herself, she was tethered by obligations, by family roles, by invisible threads pulling her back to everyone else's needs. But now, with her phone off and her location unknown, those threads had loosened, and in their absence, she began to remember who she was before her life had been filled with other people's priorities. She started writing. Not emails, not grocery lists, but real writing, the kind she hadn't done since college, when she used to dream of publishing essays or starting a blog about women carving out space in the margins. Her words were clumsy at first, rusty, but they came, and they were hers. She signed up for a beach yoga class on a whim. She laughed at how stiff her body was. No one watched. No one judged. After class, she lingered by the water, sipping lemon water and listening to a woman from Maine talk about starting over after 60. Carol didn't say much, but she really listened on. Something about that conversation stayed with her. It reminded her that she wasn't the only one learning how to live differently. That night, she walked barefoot to a little open-air cafe, tucked behind a row of sleepy gift shops. A local folk singer strummed slow melodies while candles flickered on the tables. She ordered wine, read the first chapter of a book she'd been meaning to start for 3 years. When the waitress asked if she was waiting for someone, Carol smiled and said softly, "No, Just me tonight. She wasn't lonely. She was full. The next morning, she woke up without an alarm and realized something miraculous. She'd slept through the night. No mental to-do lists. No anxious dreams about forgotten obligations. Just rest. Honest, deep rest. And with that rest came clarity. She didn't miss the chaos. She didn't miss being needed every minute of every day. She missed the twins, sure, their laughter, their sticky hugs. But she didn't miss the weight that came with it. The unspoken assumption that her time was always available. This quiet, slow, choice-filled life wasn't selfish. It was sacred. She still hadn't contacted her family. Not because she didn't love them, but because she needed space to remember how to love herself. That kind of remembering takes time, and grace, and silence. But it couldn't last forever. She knew the moment would come when she'd have to speak again, to face them, to explain, to draw new lines. And that moment was coming. Because 5 days into her solitude, she turned on her phone and saw 327 messages waiting, and among them, one name she didn't expect, her father. And with that, the silence cracked not with noise, but with the soft rustle of a door beginning to open. What came next would be harder. But Carol had changed, and there was no going back. When Carol finally turned her phone back on, the screen lit up like a Christmas tree. Missed calls, text messages, voicemails, stacked one after another, as if her absence had cracked the very core of her family's routine. The notifications kept coming for nearly a full minute. And with each buzz, a familiar dread crept up her spine, like a reflex too deeply wired to silence. She sat on the porch of her bungalow, wrapped in a light sweater, the ocean still breathing steadily a few feet away, but the calm of her surroundings couldn't shield her from what waited inside that inbox. The first voicemail was from her mother. Her voice was trembling, part fear, part fury. "Carol, where are you? This isn't funny. The boys are asking for you." They were expecting Aunt Carol at the resort. Diane's beside herself. "We just want to know you're okay." The next one came an hour later, tone already shifted. Less concern, more accusation. "I cannot believe you would do this. After everything we've done for you. You blindsided us." By the third message, the script had turned to guilt. "Your sister is in tears. The twins won't stop asking where you are. You've ruined the whole trip. Is that what you wanted?" It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. Worry, then guilt, then blame. And they were using every tool they had ever used before. But this time, Carol was watching the show from the outside, not as the dependable daughter expected to fix things, but as a woman finally seeing the cost of always being available. The texts were even more revealing. Diane's messages came fast and furious. "How could you disappear like this? You said you were going to help. The boys are crying non-stop. They don't understand why you abandoned them." Then came the real jab. "You've always been bitter about my life. Admit it." It wasn't about the vacation. It never had been. It was about control. The idea that Carol had made a decision, without seeking permission, without checking in, without sacrificing her plans to fit theirs, that was the real betrayal. Her silence had exposed just how much the family had come to rely on her compliance. And now, without it, they were scrambling. But in the middle of the noise, one message stopped her cold. It was from her father. A short text. No punctuation. Just, "Carol, please, let us know you're safe." He didn't ask her to come back. Didn't scold. Didn't lecture. And in that simplicity, there was something almost honest, something she hadn't seen in him for years. Not the voice of a man defending Diane, or upholding the old family pecking order. Just a father, unsure of how to reach the daughter he had spent decades overlooking. That message broke something open. Not her resolve, but the decades of silence she had swallowed just to keep the peace. Carol took a breath. Typed a reply. "I'm safe. I need time. Please don't contact me for a few days. I'll reach out when I'm ready." And then, before she could hesitate, she hit send and silenced the thread. She sat back in her chair, let the wind press gently against her face, and felt something powerful for the first time in her adult life. Detachment without guilt. Not because she didn't care, but because she finally did. About herself. She didn't owe an explanation for needing peace. She didn't owe her presence to people who only valued her when she was serving their needs. And she certainly didn't owe her life to a family that never once asked what she wanted for it. The messages would keep coming. The tantrums would continue. But their urgency no longer dictated her actions. She had stepped out of the play, and now watched from a seat in the audience. And as the tide pulled gently against the shore beside her, She realized this wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of boundaries. And the next chapter, that would test everything she'd just begun. To claim was waiting, just on the other side of a quiet return. The coffee shop Carol chose wasn't anything fancy. Just a small place tucked between a dry cleaner and a pharmacy in her old neighborhood, a place neutral enough to keep everyone on their best behavior, but quiet enough for words to land where they needed to. She arrived early, as always. A seat in the corner, back to the wall, eyes on the front door and the emergency exit. Old habits die hard when you've spent your life preparing for emotional fallout. Her hands trembled slightly as she sipped her lukewarm coffee. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say, written it down, edited it, read it aloud in the mirror. But now, in this moment, all she could feel was the weight of what this meeting meant, the start of a different future, or the final confirmation that nothing would ever change. When the door finally swung open, she saw them, her mother leading the pack, posture tight with indignation. Diane just behind, arms crossed, already looking wounded, and behind them, her father, slower, quieter, with eyes that didn't quite meet hers. Surprisingly, Diane's husband Mark was with them too, carrying a concerned expression, like he'd been dragged into something he wasn't sure how to manage. Carol stood, nodded politely, and gestured to the table. No one smiled. Before anyone else could speak, Carol cleared her throat. Her voice didn't shake. I want to say something before we begin, and I'd appreciate it if you all just listened. I've written it out, so I don't get derailed. There was an awkward pause. Her mother opened her mouth, then shut it again. Carol unfolded a small note from her coat pocket. I'm establishing boundaries. Real ones, they're not suggestions, and they're not negotiable. She let the silence sit. She needed them to feel it. Not the drama, but the certainty. The next 2 hours were a slow unraveling. Her mother tried the usual tactics of everything the family had done for her. Passive guilt, subtle digs, masked as concern. Diane cried, painting herself as the abandoned one, the overworked mother left unsupported. The boys cried every night you were gone, she said. They don't understand why you'd just disappear. Mark attempted a half-measured compromise, suggesting maybe Carol could just help every other weekend instead of all the time. We don't want to take advantage, he added. But even he couldn't hide how programmed the assumption had become. Through it all, Carol listened, but she didn't retreat. It was Diane's voice, sharp and defensive, that finally cracked something open. You're being selfish, Carol. Family means sacrifice. That word selfish hung in the air like a foghorn. Carol looked at her sister, calmly, and said, yes, family means sacrifice. But it's supposed to go both ways. When was the last time any of you sacrificed something for me? The silence that followed was louder than any shouting match could have been. She opened her planner, turned it around, and slid it across the table. A full year of weekends highlighted. Babysitting, errands, birthday parties that weren't hers, holidays spent making things easier for someone else. This is my time, she said. This is what you've expected from me, without asking. I didn't complain. I didn't resist. But I never agreed to become your backup plan. And I'm not doing it anymore. Her mother jumped in, clearly rattled. But that's what aunts do. No, Carol replied, voice steady now. That's what paid babysitters do. And Diane, if you need this much help, maybe it's time to hire one. That broke the room open. Diane pushed back from the table, tears brimming, but her rage outweighing them. She stormed out, muttering something about betrayal. Their mother followed, flustered and tight-lipped, her face hardening with each step. But Mark stayed seated. He looked at Carol, really looked at her, and said quietly, I think we've leaned on you more than we realized. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing anyone had offered her in years. Her father remained seated too, expression unreadable. Finally, he said, we never meant to make you feel this way. It wasn't enough. But it was something. After they left, Carol sat for a while, letting the air settle around her. She didn't cry, she didn't second-guess. She simply gathered her things, stood up, and walked out without looking back. The next day, she moved to a new apartment on the other side of town, quieter, but entirely her own. She changed her phone number, she updated her work contacts. She gave her new address only to the people she trusted. And for the first time in her adult life, she wasn't waiting for a family dinner, or an invitation, or a crisis. She was waiting for herself. Because what came next wasn't about isolation. It was about ownership, and the life she was building, now brick by brick. Choice by choice was finally hers. It was a grey Thursday morning when Carol carried the last box into her new apartment, a modest third-floor walk-up in an older brick building on the quiet side of Charleston. The air smelled faintly of rain and unpacked cardboard, and the hallway creaked under her feet as she stepped inside. No one helped her move. She didn't ask, and somehow, that felt like victory. The space was small. A one-bedroom with a narrow galley kitchen, windows that let in the morning sun just right, and floors that bore the gentle scars of previous tenants. But it was hers, not a hand-me-down guest room. Not a temporary space filled with other people's things. It was the first place Carol had chosen completely on her own, without compromise, without anyone else's opinion. And that made it feel expansive. She set the final box down by the window and took a deep breath. No family photos lined the walls yet. No books on the shelves. Just the hum of possibility. The silence inside wasn't empty, it was sacred. She was used to chaos. Used to doors swinging open unannounced, phones ringing off the hook, the background noise of constant expectation. But here, there were no footsteps but her own. No lists but the ones she wrote. No obligations lingering in the corners. She had prepared for this, quietly and methodically. Changed the locks. Updated her emergency contacts at work. Let her manager know not to patch through personal calls anymore, especially from relatives. Only a handful of close friends had her new number. And not even her mother knew her new address. It wasn't an act of spite. It was protection. A line drawn in the sand with intention, not resentment. The first weekend, she didn't do much. She lit a candle, unpacked slowly, took her time hanging up clothes, savoring the decision of where things would go. She spent an entire afternoon rearranging the furniture because she could. No one was rushing her. No one was coming over with suggestions. She even let herself do something she hadn't done in years. Nothing. No productivity, no guilt, and in that stillness, something tender bloomed. She started noticing things she'd once forgotten she loved. Long, quiet mornings with coffee and jazz. Handwriting letters instead of texts. The pleasure of slicing vegetables without a deadline. She signed up for a weekend pottery class. Walked through the farmer's market without a grocery list. Wandered into a used bookstore and stayed for 2 hours just because she felt like it. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't some grand rebirth. But it was real. And for the first time in decades, her time felt like it belonged to her. Of course, her absence didn't go unnoticed. Her mother tried calling her work, only to be told Carol no longer accepted outside calls. Diane left cryptic, guilt-laced messages with mutual acquaintances. Even her father, in a moment of quiet rebellion, left a voicemail saying he hoped she was happy and that maybe someday they could talk again. But none of it pulled her back. Because Carol wasn't running anymore. She was building. Slowly, steadily, with intention. She framed a quote above her desk. The first thing she saw each morning. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is set yourself free. And every time she read it, she felt just a little lighter. She knew this life wouldn't be perfect. There would be loneliness. There would be guilt that crept in on rainy afternoons or holidays spent differently. But there would also be space. And freedom. And a deep, quiet joy that came from living by her own design. The chapter hadn't closed on her family, but a new one had opened. And in it, Carol wasn't a supporting character anymore. She was the author. A week after settling into her new apartment, Carol opened her mailbox to find something unexpected, a small padded envelope addressed in a child's handwriting. Barely legible, the letters uneven and wide. Inside was a handmade card from the twins, crayon drawings of stick figures on a beach, 2 smiling boys, and 1 woman labeled Aunt Carol. Tucked inside was a note, clearly dictated, but sweet all the same. We miss you. Mummy says you're on a break. Please come back soon. Carol, read it once, then again, then placed it gently on the kitchen counter, beside a blooming basil plant. Her heart pulled in 2 directions. She loved those boys of that, there was never any doubt. But for the first time, she was learning that love didn't have to mean self-abandonment. That showing up didn't have to look like giving up your weekends, your career, your quiet love. She realized, had always been presented to her as an equation. Sacrifice equals devotion. The more you give, the more you care. But no one had ever explained that love without boundaries wasn't love at all, it was martyrdom. And martyrdom leaves nothing behind but resentment. So she sat down that evening, lit a small lamp, and wrote a letter back. Dear Sam and Joey, I love you both very much. You're growing up so fast, and I hope you're having fun. I'm taking some time right now to rest and do things that make me feel good. Just like you might take a nap after a big day. It doesn't mean I don't love you. It just means grown-ups need rest too, especially when they've been tired for a long time. I'll see you again someday soon. But in a way that makes all of us feel happy, not just helpful. Love always. Aunt Carol. She knew there was a good chance Diane wouldn't read them the letter. But that wasn't the point. Carol wasn't trying to fix the narrative. She was rewriting her part in it. In this new chapter of her life, she began building relationships differently, from intention, not obligation. She accepted invitations that made her feel seen, declined ones that didn't. She formed slow, deliberate friendships with people who didn't ask her to earn their attention, only to share it. At pottery class, there was Ruth, a retired librarian, with a dry wit and a gentle spirit, who taught Carol how to shape bowls that didn't collapse in the kiln. At work, there was Jordan, a younger co-worker who had once mistaken Carol's quiet for passivity, but now came to her for advice and perspective. And there was Kevin, the man she'd met at the beach cafe, still a friend, maybe more someday, but for now, someone who never made her feel like she had to apologize for needing space. It was subtle at first. This new way of loving, it didn't come with fanfare or dramatic declarations. It came with consistent kindness, with small, shared silences, with freedom. She noticed that the guilt, once loud and constant, now only showed up in whispers. And even then, she could meet it with compassion instead of compliance. She still loved her family. That hadn't changed. But the definition of love had no longer a currency to be exchanged for approval. No longer a leash, no longer a debt. Love, real love, was mutual, voluntary, chosen, and Carol, for the first time in her life, was choosing herself without needing permission. What lay ahead would test that choice again, but she was no longer afraid of being misunderstood. She was finally clear on one thing: her worth didn't require validation, and her heart, for all its tenderness, didn't belong to everyone who asked for it. It belonged to her first. The word freedom used to feel like fiction, to Carol like something reserved for people with fewer ties, less history, fewer expectations pinned to their shoulders. In her world, choosing space had always been framed as abandonment. Choosing self-care was painted as selfishness. And every time she tried to take a breath for herself, someone else's voice filled her lungs. But living alone in that sun-warmed apartment, waking up each day with her own choices ahead of her, Carol began to understand. Freedom wasn't betrayal. It was recovery. She had spent so many years believing she owed her time, her silence, her weekends, her energy to maintain peace, to prove her loyalty, to avoid the label of difficult. But peace bought through silence isn't peace. It's suppression. And loyalty that's never returned isn't noble, it's exhausting. The shift in her life wasn't sudden. It happened in small, almost invisible ways. She stopped explaining herself. She stopped apologizing for being unavailable. She stopped flinching every time the phone rang when her mother left a new voicemail that ended with, "We raised you better than this." Carol didn't cry this time. She didn't pace the kitchen or second-guess her boundaries. She just pressed delete. Not out of cruelty, but because she was done defending her healing to those who refused to see the harm. She no longer saw herself as broken. She saw herself as healing. And that distinction changed everything. Freedom wasn't loud. It didn't come with trumpets or defiance. It came with slow mornings and real rest. With meals eaten in silence, and the first sincere laugh in weeks. It came in saying no without guilt. In saying yes because she wanted to, not because she felt obligated. She realized she wasn't missing from her family's life. She had simply stepped out of the role they wrote for her. And they didn't know how to respond to that. Some reacted with manipulation, others with silence. Diane posted thinly veiled comments online about sisters who walk away from their responsibilities. But they no longer cut Carol the way they once had. She had stopped looking for herself in other people's reflections. What surprised her most was how clear everything became once she let go of the noise. Her work improved. Her health steadied. She started running again around the block, just to feel her body move. She picked up her old journal and began to write, not about what hurt, but about what was healing. There was grief, of course, not just for what she lost, but for what she never had. The unconditional kind of love that didn't come with caveats or consequences. But even grief became softer when she accepted it. When she stopped fighting to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding her. In therapy, her counselor called it post-traumatic growth, the moment where the wound becomes a window. Carol had lived for so long in the trauma that she forgot what it meant to grow outside of it. But now she was building something new, and it wasn't perfect. But it was hers. One evening, she wrote a line on a sticky note and placed it above her sink. Love that costs your identity isn't love, it's conditioning. She read it every day, and slowly she believed it. Carol knew there might come a time when a conversation with her family could happen again, one based on mutual respect, not guilt. But she also knew it might not. And for the first time, either outcome was okay. Because her life no longer depended on being accepted by people who only loved the version of her that gave everything and asked for nothing. She had nothing left to prove and everything left to live. As she stood by the window that night, a breeze moved through the curtains, light and quiet. She wasn't waiting anymore for validation, for apology, for permission. She was free. And for Carol, that wasn't a rebellion. It was a return to herself. Carol's days no longer followed anyone else's calendar. There were no more emergency babysitting calls, no last-minute errands wrapped in guilt, no obligations she hadn't agreed to. Her time now moved to the rhythm of her own choosing, slow when it needed to be, full when she wanted it to be, and quiet in ways she never realized she needed. Her apartment had changed too. It no longer looked like a temporary escape. It had become a reflection of her framed photos of new friends from pottery class, the handmade bowls she'd finally managed to glaze without cracking, a shelf of books she was actually reading for pleasure, not distraction. There was a warmth in the space that came not from what she had filled it with, but from what she had let go. One Saturday morning, she walked to the corner cafe and bumped into an old acquaintance from high school, someone she hadn't seen in over 20 years. They caught up briefly, and as the woman walked away, she paused, turned, and said, "You look lighter, younger, even." Carol smiled. It wasn't just a compliment. It was a confirmation. She felt lighter. For so long, her identity had been tied to roles assigned by others. The quiet daughter, the backup sister, the dependable aunt. She had spent decades living a script someone else had written, one where her desires were subplots, where her needs were always secondary. And when she finally stepped off that stage, she wasn't sure who she was without the costume. But now, with each day that passed, she wasn't just discovering who she was deciding it. She chose joy in small things. Afternoon walks through the park with a cup of cider, journaling by the window during spring rain, late-night phone calls with new friends who asked, "How are you doing?" and actually meant it. Her job had blossomed too. Without constant interruptions, her work sharpened. Her ideas came easier. She was promoted to lead a new project, a first for her, and this time, she said yes, without asking anyone else's permission. And when she flew out for the launch meeting in Austin, she booked a second night just to explore the city alone. Not because she needed to escape, because she wanted to experience something on her own terms. She wasn't just healing, she was expanding. Her relationship with her family remained distant. There were attempts to reconnect, her mother's voicemail declaring, "This phase has gone on long enough," and Diane's holiday cards signed with a passive-aggressive flourish. But Carol no longer felt the old pull to explain herself. She had stopped asking to be understood. Now, she simply lived in truth. There was sadness there, of course. Letting go of the fantasy that one day they'd change, or see her clearly, wasn't easy. But it was clean pain, honest, and far easier to carry than the weight of perpetual disappointment. One afternoon, her phone buzzed with an unexpected message. It was from Mark, Diane's husband. "The boys are doing well. We hired help. Diane's still adjusting. I just thought you'd want to know." Then another line. "What you did, it made things better. Harder at first, but better." Carol stared at the message for a long time, then turned off her phone and smiled to herself. Not out of pride, but relief. A confirmation, once again, that walking away hadn't been abandonment, it had been necessary. The life she was building didn't need applause. It didn't need validation. It just needed to feel like hers. She spent that evening on the balcony, sipping tea, wrapped in a shawl gifted by a coworker. The sun dipped behind the rooftops, and the wind carried the faint scent of honeysuckle. Nothing dramatic happened. No revelations. No perfect closure. Just presence. She wasn't fixing anyone's problems. She wasn't rescuing anyone's plans. She wasn't proving anything. She was simply living a life of her own. Finally untethered from the roles they gave her, and it was enough. More than enough. There was a time when Carol would have done anything to avoid being called selfish. She shaped her entire life around that fear, taking on extra shifts, saying yes when she meant no, showing up for people who never once asked what she needed in return. She wore selflessness like armor, thinking it made her good, worthy, lovable. But underneath, she was tired. Not the kind of tired a weekend nap could fix, but the deep, bone-level kind that comes from being emotionally overdrawn for decades. It took 35 years for her to understand that choosing herself was never selfish. It was survival. In the stillness of her new life, that truth became clearer each day. The more she slowed down, the more she saw how much she had given, how much had been taken not out of malice, but out of habit. Generosity had been her language, but it was never meant to be her cage. She looked back often not to dwell, but to honor how far she'd come. The girl who hid her achievements because no one noticed. The young woman who worked 2 jobs while her sister got praise for existing. The aunt who became a stand-in parent because she didn't have kids of her own. All those versions of herself deserved to be seen and loved and forgiven. She no longer needed to prove her heart by how much it could stretch. She proved it now by how well it could hold space for her own joy, her own rest, her own becoming. People still had opinions. Her mother's latest birthday card had been a thinly veiled sermon, layered with phrases like, "Families stick together, and you'll understand when you're older." Diane's social media still pulsed with the performance of perfection, but none of it reached Carol in the same way. Because she was grounded now, not defensive, not angry, just rooted in the truth that boundaries are a form of love. 2. She began writing again, personal essays, short reflections, small stories that lived in the corners of real life. She didn't publish them, not yet. But she wrote because it helped her hear herself again, her voice, her truth, without interruption. The people in her life now weren't there out of duty. They were there by choice. Real friends who didn't expect her to carry more than she offered. A quiet man named Kevin, who respected her pace and asked questions no one had ever thought to ask. Not what do you do, but what brings you peace. And maybe that was the most radical shift of all. Her life wasn't just about healing anymore. It was about thriving. One afternoon, while reorganizing a drawer, she found the printed confirmation of the first hotel she'd booked on the island. The trip that had quietly rewritten everything. She held the paper in her hand and smiled, not because it was a big, dramatic moment, but because it was hers. That decision to go, to choose herself, to disappear for a while, wasn't about escape. It was about returning to the person she was always meant to be. She folded the paper, tucked it into her journal, and wrote beneath it in soft pencil, "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is set yourself free." Then she poured herself a cup of tea, opened the window to let the wind drift through, and sat down, not to serve, not to solve, but simply to be. Not everyone would understand the choices she'd made, but for the first time, she didn't need them to, because she understood them, and that was enough.